Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Richard Williams, and I'm the Vice President of Policy Research at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I also direct the Mercatus Regulatory Studies program. We're excited about today's program, and I hope that each of you will come away with a better understanding of the importance and significance of regulation and rulemaking, particularly in your work as policy advisors to Congress. So let me start with a question. How many of you know approximately how many people in the federal government, particularly in the executive branch agencies, are busy right now writing regulations? Anybody? Anybody? About 200,000. Okay, so let me ask you another question. How many of you know in the Office of Management and Budget how many people are reviewing those regulations? Come on, make a guess. There was a guess of 50. It's actually less than 40. So who's left then to review these regulations? It's you. So that's a problem. And let me tell you, before coming to Mercatus, I spent 27 years at the Food and Drug Administration as an economist working on a variety of food safety and nutrition regulations. And during my time at the Food and Drug Administration, there was one thing that I came to know that was essential that you have to know before you put a regulation in place. And what that is whether or not that regulation will accomplish a specific goal. I can tell you, every president since President Carter has tried through executive orders and OMB oversight to get agencies to answer that question. What's it going to do? What's it going to accomplish? But I can also tell you that every president since President Truman has been frustrated with agencies, their ability to control agencies and to answer that question. Well, why is it important? The reason is that too often good intentions in regulatory agencies have bad outcomes. And that's because they don't do the work up front. Or if they did the work up front, they simply ignore it. Because of this problem, there's been a long-standing bipartisan consensus that we ought to examine basic questions before we regulate, to know particularly whether or not a regulation is going to achieve goals. And here are the things that the presidents have asked the agencies to ask themselves and answer. What are the underlying causes that you're trying to address in this regulation? And what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? What options do you have for solving that problem? Who should solve the problem? Should it be the federal government? Should it be states and localities? Should it be just the market that will take care of it? And finally, what are the consequences of those options? What are the costs? What's it going to cost us to do what you want to do? And what are the benefits? What outcomes do we expect it to get? Now, some of you who are familiar with the regulatory system perhaps already know that we have rules on the books right now that tell agencies they are supposed to ask and answer those questions. Those are what I just talked about, the President's executive order requirements for regulatory impact analysis and the President's ARM OMB review. But again, I can tell you as a former FDA economist, I've experienced firsthand far too often the fact that agencies don't ask those questions, the decision makers don't have that information in front of them when they make decisions. And it's not just me. Research by the Mercatus Center and other public policy research organizations and universities have consistently demonstrated time and time again that agencies don't do the analysis up front or they do it badly prior to regulating. Not only that, once these regulations get passed, there's essentially virtually no review of these regulations to know whether or not they're accomplishing anything. So neither Congress nor the public nor anyone else knows whether or not these regulations are accomplishing what they intended to accomplish. And remember, not accomplishing anything is not the same thing as no impact. All of this stuff that we make firms and small governments like states and localities, all the things that we make them do means that those resources aren't put into something productive, and that costs us. Regulation by any measure is growing. And right now, as of about 2010, there are more than 1 million requirements that firms and states and localities have to look at to know whether or not they're in compliance with those regulations. And regulations have become much more expansive in every part of our national life, all the way from education and healthcare national security and finance, all are subject to thousands of complex regulatory requirements. And that's where you come in. Understanding how regulation operates and how reform can improve regulatory policy is essential for every single congressional staffer. Regulation and rulemaking are not subjects just for lawyers and legal experts alone. You also have to know this. So today, we have an excellent lineup of speakers for you, and they're going to address several topics. First is the shift from lawmaking to regulatory agencies and the consequences of that shift. The economic ripples of regulation across the economy as a whole, and the legal mechanisms that shift regulation from serving the public interest to private preferential interests. And finally, how reforms can define a path forward and get us regulations that are accountable and results-oriented. And if we get that kind of reform, it will accomplish three things. We will get regulation that will solve more problems at lower costs with fewer regulations, and that's the goal. So let me start. It's an honor today to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Matt Spalding. He's an Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs for Hillsdale College right here in Washington, D.C. And he's going to start our program out with a description of how the regulatory state evolved and how it changes the relationships amongst our three branches of government. So please join me in welcoming Matt Spalding.
Morning. It's great to be with you. Thank you for coming. I'm very happy to be here with the Mercatus Center, who's doing some fabulous work about this question. But I've been tasked to try to put this in some broader context. Why should we be concerned about regulations? What does this mean for government and the role of government and constitutional rule in the United States? So I've got a pretty broad task, and I'm going to try to paint a very broad picture and a very pointed and stark picture for you, because I think you need to see this very clearly to justify and understand what you're trying to do and try to accomplish. Let me start with a practical observation of the break with the American founding. That is, the break caused by the American founding, and take that as my beginning point. Before the American founding, virtually everyone in the world were serfs. There were subjects, literally subject to somebody else. This changes, because before that time, that meant that the person that had the power essentially made all the rules. The objective of the American founding was to break that old form of despotism, arbitrary will of the stronger, based on force and fraud, masked by claims of long inheritance or divine right. Every government at the time was based on some claim without popular consent. The founders' objective was to change that and put into place the rule of law, decentralize political authority, stop the limit government in a way that would secure and enable rights defined in the Declaration of Independence. And yet here we are today, covered by this vast web of rules and regulations, endless policies and programs emanating from a central government. The greatest revolution, if you will, the greatest change since the American founding in our political history and in political science has been a fundamental shift away from the institutions of constitutional government, something symbolizing or something resembling that designed by the founders, towards an oligarchy of unelected experts. They rule over virtually every aspect of our lives, ostensibly in the name of the American people, but in actuality, some sort of claim having to do with science, policy expertise, and administrative efficiency. If this way of governing, this regime, if you will, becomes the norm, which is to say that's the normal way that politics works, but also not merely among intellectual and political elites, but accepted by the American people, if it becomes the defining characteristic of how we govern ourselves as a country, I believe it marks the beginning of the end, if you will, of self-government. It is a different thing. Let me explain quickly what I mean by that. Our regime, the United States, this country, is defined by two core documents, one defining rights, the other defining powers, right? The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Rights are understood to be grounded in nature, the laws of nature and nature's God, a self-evident truth, the document says. What this does fundamentally is makes that break I referred to earlier. That is to say, rights are no longer by definition held by the state, by government, by the tyrant, the king, the despot, but the rights are shifted to the people, the sovereign people. As a result, governments only have powers, and they exercise those powers and gain their legitimacy from consent, the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution, on the other hand, is the written form by which those powers are delegated to government based on the sovereign rights of the people. Those powers are not delegated to government as a whole. As I like to point out to all of my friends, the federal government, technically speaking, has no power. Powers are delegated to the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, the core functions of government. This creates, fundamentally, the important doctrine called the separation of powers. Right? Powers of different types are given to different branches. Each one of those branches exercises those powers according to the particular power that's given in one of those first three articles of the Constitution, but also the duties it has as a result. They each then check and balance each other. Recall our readings long ago of the Federalist Papers, such that the structure of government, right, the way it operates, the way rules are made, laws are made, becomes the most fundamental aspect of the Constitution. Not the parchment barriers, not merely the written aspects of it, but its structure, according to Madison, was the most important thing. That prevents faction, recall Federalist 10, but also creates the circumstances for allowing self-government. It's not that the American founders were opposed to rules and regulations. You recall in the Declaration one of my favorite phrases, objecting to the king having erected a multitude of new offices sent hither to harass our people and eat out their substance. They opposed overregulation, but they recognized that it was necessary for government. They argued for what they called an improved science of politics. But there was also something called a new science of politics that came up soon thereafter, rising from the French philosophes and others, who looked to science, reason, modern science, to bring about what they called a technocracy, a way of governing, a way of organizing things so that science brought technological changes and new methods of study to the physical world, so it can also to politics. The late 19th century progressives in this country took up this argument, combined it with ideas they had learned from German idealism and historicism, and Americanized it, seeking to replace U.S. constitutional politics with an administrative science of things. This scientific view questioned the very idea of a self-governing citizen. Liberty is no longer a condition consistent with human nature and the exercise of God-given natural rights, right? The whole theory of the American founding, but it becomes an evolving concept to be socially constructed. Government is liberated from its limitations and becomes a dynamic and evolving state, constantly expanding and changing to achieve progress. Right? This new view, this administrative view, under that, everything is socialized under the jurisdiction of the state, subject to be regulated, distributed, denied, or taken away in the name of some political objective. In the administrative view, this term bureaucracy, which we use to refer to it today, of course, comes from the French for desk and the Greek for rule, the rule of desks. It was originally satirical, but for the progressives, it was a noble endeavor. They are the true agents of democracy, according to Herbert Crowley. Politics would give the guidelines, right? That's the role of Congress. But the real work of government would be done by administration, handled by specialists and experts, those who knew what they were doing. Such we begin to see the growth of this new structure. Administrative departments, agencies, bureaucracies, and expansion of administration. Delegation. Congress has the legislative power, but what happens under the administrative state, a theory of the progressives themselves, is that Congress not merely gives over certain powers to agencies to do things, given strict guidelines from Congress, but they increasingly actually delegate their lawmaking power to those agencies and bureaucracies directly, such that they are essentially making the laws. This, I would argue, is not merely an aspect of modern political life, and I wish to underscore that to you. Right? This regulatory environment we are now observing is not merely what happens so many years after the founding. This is how it goes. It's not merely an extension of the founders' recognition of the need for good administration. It's not merely an adaptation of the existing structure. It is actually a new and all-encompassing form of organization. Which is to say that this administrative state, this regulatory state, is not a symptom of the problem. It is the problem. Now, we've been moving down this path in fits and starts for some time. I referred to the progressives already. The early progressives forms which gave rise to a theory of administrating through regulation, but also some of the first departments and agencies. Of course, there are the New Deals or interventions in the economy as well. But the real shift, the important shift, and expansion occurred more recently, under and after the Great Society. The expansion of regulatory activities on a society-wide scale in the 1960s and 1970s led to a vast new centralizing authority in the federal government, such that today the primary function of government, I would suggest to you, is not legislating or achieving justice or breaking faction or any of the things understood by the founders. The primary function of government today, for all intents and purposes, is to regulate. And because of the nature of that regulation and how it occurs, Congress has become merely a supervisory power body exercising oversight of the true lawmakers, administrative policymakers. A recent report suggested or added up what those two things do. On average, Congress passes around 50 substantive pieces of legislation a year, whereas on average, all the agencies and bureaucracies and departments issue about 4,000 regulations in the same time. It is this model, if you will, what Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously referred to as the policy approach, that we're trapped in today. Everything, from financial restructuring to environmental regulation, must be dealt with, what? Comprehensively. Why? Because it must be done centrally and uniformly, and it must be done across the board. Right? That's what this new science of politics teaches us. Healthcare reform is a good example of that. Large swath of the economy, massive regulatory authority, 100 more collection of federal agencies, bureaus, and commissions. Little or nothing is to be allowed outside of that regulatory scheme, except for a few exemptions. Same thing with Dodd-Frank. If this way of doing things becomes settled law, which is to say this process, this method is fixed in place, it really will go far in cementing a post-constitutional administrative state. The fact that we are debating today an executive who seems to be acting outside of the law, to me, is actually no surprise at all. It's a symptom of the problem. When Congress delegates so much authority to agencies in the administration, a president, given the power to execute the law, logically follows what he needs to do to execute those laws, fill the gaps, correct the mistakes of Congress. And assuming more and more of these things, this extended reach of the state pushes into the shadows all the various other institutions, the family, the free market, educational institutions. It pushes them more and more into the shadows of public life, and it does undermine America's culture and civic society. We fall into a habit of looking to government to solve more and more of our problems, removing risk from life, providing all of our needs and pleasures. It's commonplace now for individuals to look to government to relieve their most ordinary concerns, support their basic endeavors, compensate them from the simplest injuries they suffer in daily affairs. All these demands are considered more and more to be rights today, and the list is ever expanding. By feeding the entitlement mentality often, rather than promoting self-reliance and independence, administrative government also encourages a certain slavish character, if you will, incompatible with republicanism. Once self-governing citizens are degrading themselves slowly into passive subjects of an impersonal bureaucratic nation-state. Sounds an odd observation. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy American, 1840, warned us of this. Once citizens give up their liberty for comfortable security and the responsibility of self-government for the ease of government as parent, democratic government can become a type of soft despotism, he warned, which is less coercive in its methods, more benign in its concerns than hard despotism, but perhaps more despotic in the end for this very reason. Now, it's not all bad, which say it's not inevitable that this is the way we operate. Tocqueville himself observed as well that this form of governing was a violation of human nature. James Madison, throughout the Federalist Papers, objects to this way of governing. Alexander Hamilton said it was a heresy to suggest that all forms of government, that which is best administered is the best. Perhaps the greatest critique of this form of governing, of bureaucracy, comes from Winston Churchill, oddly enough. He, in his long career of statesmanship, from 1900 up into the 1960s, saw in England the rise of new forms of government. And one of his observations, one of his greatest concerns, especially in his essays written in the 1930s, was the new and increasing application of science, or the claim of scientific methods, to rule. And he warned of this as he saw it rising throughout Europe. The Bolsheviks, the socialists, and as he looked across the ocean, in some observations, warning Franklin Roosevelt about some of the structures of the New Deal. These forms, he argued, denied human nature. They were problematic, but there was nothing new in them, he argued. Which is to say, there's nothing new in these forms of administering politics based on claims of science that had not already been learned and applied through the white ant, he says in one essay. Which is to say that this is merely the logic of ants and beehives. It's organization, pure and simple. But we have a source of hope, which is that the great safeguard and glory of mankind, he writes in an essay called Mass Effects of Modern Life in the 1930s. The great hope and safeguard, the glory of mankind, is that men are easy to lead but hard to drive. That observation through his essays and writings and politics gave him great hope for change and the possibility of turning the situation around. If you recall, after the Second World War, he's defeated very quickly as prime minister, but he comes back in the 1950s in a campaign against what? The socialists in England. And he made his theme the bureaucracy versus the people. Our hope today, I would argue to you, is that these regulations, some small, petty, many large and very expensive, numerous to be sure, all of that is becoming more and more apparent to more and more people. It is not by the consolation or concentration of powers, but their distribution that government is affected, Thomas Jefferson once wrote. Were we directed from Washington when to sow and when to reap, we should soon want bread. As these regulations become more and more apparent throughout more and more aspects of our lives, and more people realize the connection between them, which is to say, this is not merely this rogue agency or that rogue agency, but there's a pattern, they increasingly object because it violates their nature. They're easy to lead, but hard to drive. And so our great objective, I would suggest, and your discussion today, I think, will point back to this, is that our main action here should be to drive these regulations as much as possible back into politics. Don't misunderstand my reference to politics. I mean it in the general sense. The Madisonian solution, I would suggest to you, is to put those regulations currently done by those outside of consent back into the political structures of the Constitution. Push them back into the legislative branch, that's subject to election and consent, which drives it back into politics of the American people. Then, and only then, it seems to me, can we have a fundamental discussion, not merely about reform around the edges, but serious fundamental reform, things like you'll be discussing today, which not merely make things better, although they will, but also change the very nature and turn and dynamic of this modern problem. That, it suggests to me, is the challenge we face today, and because of the nature of the thing and our potential debate between bureaucratic rule and a reestablishment of self-government is also our best hope. Thank you.